Hello everyone, my name is JJ, and we're going to be talking about a special historical topic that I love very much, both as a history nerd and as a academic student who has studied Roman history and has watched documentaries on Netflix and on YouTube. It's one of the most touching topics historians often still argue about today, and that is the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Now, before we discuss, Rome's decline and the reasons it fell, we have to also understand the rise of such an empire. Now, Rome, to many modern uh, citizens of the world, is just a holiday vacation spot in Italy. It's the capital of Italy, and it's where people go to kind of wonder how old something is. So, like, for example, most people go to Rome to see like the Colosseum, and would have wondered, and they're like, "Wow, this thing is old," but exactly how old? And it's quite funny to touch on that topic because not many people know how old it is, and vaguely it was formed or built by the Emperor Vespasian around the mid first century. But on a side note, it's still existing today because people loved it. But the topic and focus of this video is not about the Colosseum. Instead, it's about what I mentioned, the rise and fall of Rome. Now, Rome was founded in the 7th century BC during classical antiquity by, according to legend, two people, Romulus and Remus. And if you read Virgil's Aeneid, it was actually founded by Aeneas, who came from Troy after its destruction by the Greeks. But all in all, it was founded by these two boys, and it became a kingdom, which later was usurped and overthrown to form the memorable and well-known Roman Republic, which further went on to unify the Italian peninsula, fighting in the Samnite Wars, and eventually spreading its wing far enough into northern Cisalpine Gaul, then Gaul, waging war against the Greeks, waging war against the North African Carthaginians, spreading into modern day Hispania, Spain. Eventually, after the formation of the empire, it was spread even further. Now, before we go on to talk about the empire and the later republic, let's look at the map. So this is a map of the Roman Republic on the death of Julius Caesar. So we all know Julius Caesar from Shakespeare, and we know Julius Caesar from possibly HBO and other Hollywood reenactments of Romans. And Julius Caesar was very, very important in kind of transitioning the dying republic from an empire from a government that was in the hands of a select few, the senatorial elite, the patricians, and he kind of took some of that power and gave it to people who were represented by tribunes. But a lot of people in this during this time didn't like that. They were traditionalists. They liked to keep what's traditional and what's right in their own hands, and Caesar kind of got assassinated because of that in 44 BC. But let's look at the map in detail. Let's look at the map and see how far the empire, how far the republic has expanded in 44 BC. We can see that the Italian peninsula is unified. We see that after the Punic Wars, the first, second, and third, we see that North Africa has come into the hands of the republic. We see that Egypt, however, is still independently owned by the Ptolemies. And we can see that parts of the Levant is still independent. However, we can see that Cyprus, Syria, the coastal cities there, Tarsus, Antioch, has come into the power and possession of the Republic. Parts of Anatolia and all of Greece has also come into possession of the Republic, as well as Caesar's most memorable accomplishment, his conquest of Gaul. Something that took the Republic centuries and many attempts to do, he managed to do within a few years, which to many historians is his greatest accomplishment and feat. Now, we also know that Julius Caesar attempted to conquer Britain with, unfortunately, not as good results as Gaul. But aside from that, let's jump back into our main topic. So, Julius Caesar had a nephew named Octavian, who he adopted prior to his death, and he gave all his wealth to. And Octavian, as a man himself, right here, wasn't really a gifted military leader. He was very much a careful, organized, um, political genius, if you will. Like, he understood that his uncle Julius Caesar was killed off because he wasn't careful. He was open to the people, and instead he realized that, and throughout his life, his later life, he would be very careful whom to trust. He would trust only a select amount of people, but at the same time, he was also a massive propagandist. So he would install an image of himself into the Roman people as a hopeful, very kind, merciful leader, and he would also kind of, through propaganda, force the Roman people to think that he was their best choice, and that power should instead be temporarily given to him because of the circumstances. And with such power, he slowly saw that with such power he needed responsibility, and what he did was he transitioned the republic into an empire. He knew that the republic at this point had been in decades, if not almost a century, of civil war between prominent generals, powerful senators, and wealthy aristocrats and patricians. So he knows that he's learned, he's seen through the lives of Gaius Marius, Sulla, um, Gaius Pompey, both the Pompeius and his son. He's he's seen through Mark Antony, Lepidus. He's seen and he's learned from all the mistakes of these people. Hence, when he later forms the second triumvirate with Mark Antony and Lepidus, he eventually knows that it's not going to work out, and he knows that the Roman society, both as a sovereign state, as a culture, and its people, need a new reorganized state, and thus he forms the Roman Empire in 27 BC, and he would go on to rule the empire as the sole ruler, as the first citizen, for over 40 years. And in those 40 years, he would expand the empire even further. So here's a map of the Roman Empire from, like, I believe 31 BC to 14 AD, and it shows pretty much the Roman Empire from the Roman Empire during his founding in 27 BC all the way up till his death in 14 AD. Now, you can see that compared to the last map, the Roman Empire has expanded even further. For example, it has conquered most of Anatolia, most of modern day Turkey that we know will come into the possession of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. It has conquered all of the Levant, and after defeating Anthony at the Battle of Actium, it has conquered all of Ptolemy Egypt, more of North Africa, and all of Hispania and Gaul. And he did, for at one point, start the conquest of Germania, but because of an event known as the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, where he lost 3 whole legions, he never attempted to conquer Germania again. And to the extent of Rome's borders with Germania was as far as it got in this map. Probably more like around here, around where Chatti is. Yeah, like this became the official border of the empire during later years with later emperors. Now, from the conquests and the loot that he obtained from his numerous campaigns, he was able to do a lot of things. First, he paid off his legions. He equipped them. He trained them even better than they already were. He relied a lot, however, during his time on brilliant commanders. He himself was a very brilliant politician, but he was no warrior emperor per se. His best friend Marcus Agrippa was the reason he was able to succeed and form the empire. Marcus Agrippa was the man responsible for the Battle of Actium, the numerous campaigns in the Middle East, Gaul, Hispania, North Africa. It was all because he had talented people. In his family, he also had talented family members, his descendants, per se. One of them was Gaius Drusus, another was Germanicus, and of course, all three of these men were on his list of potential successors whom would inherit his empire and his ambition and his goals upon his death. Unfortunately, all three of these men died under mysterious circumstances, either through war or through treachery, and he outlives them all. So, Augustus forms this nice, peaceful 40-year reign, and during this reign, he transitions the city of Rome from a declining brick city truly into a city of innovative learning, a city that had unparalleled engineering done, providing what we know best with Rome. Its aqueducts, its its public baths, its grandeur statues, its public works were overexpanded under Augustus. Hence is another reason why a lot of Augustus's busts and statues and columns, all these buildings and the projects that Augustus started, and many of them he finished, still exist today. And it just goes to show you the sheer respect and volume of gratitude the Roman people had towards this emperor. And it also is attributed to the fact that Augustus himself was a great master of propaganda. We all know that Augustus himself was the greatest example of he was no military leader. However, through propaganda, the Roman people believe he was, and it is also with Augustus that every emperor thereafter was deified as a god. And Augustus's reign was very successful because he was able to both politically, militarily, and religiously succeed, where a lot of emperors after him were not able to. From the side of the government, he was able to gain the trust of the senatorial patricians, the senators, as well as the people, and most importantly, he was able to gain the loyalty of his legions. When he first assumed the emperorship, the Republic had about 50 legions. He cut that down into 25, about 20, 30 legions, and then around there, the Tumber Forest, he lost 3, but eventually, throughout Roman history, up till the fall in 476, Rome had about 30-ish legions, losing some here and there, and then they either get reinstated or reformed under a new sigil and banner. However, Augustus was able to gain the loyalty of the military, feed them, provide for them, gain their trust. He was able to win over the people, both through his wise administrative guidance and tactics, as well as through propaganda, and he was also able to win over the patricians and equalize the government in a position that the senators, the patricians, the wealthy still, held on to their titles as like consuls and tribunes and quaesars, you name it. But all that power was now in the hands of Augustus, and they probably knew that, but they were happy and content with with the fact that they were still a counselor or a senator or a consul. So that was something that remained. Now after Augustus dies, or actually before Augustus dies, he knows that his death is kind of imminent, and he tries to find a successor. And at this point, the three main person we mentioned are dead, and the only viable person left is a man named Tiberius. And Tiberius isn't the worst emperor, but he's also not the best emperor. He was kind of groomed to be emperor, but he lacked the vision, the ambition, and the motivation that Augustus had when Augustus formed the empire. He is known historically, Tiberius the First was known historically as a man that didn't want the empire, but got it anyway. Because everybody that wanted the empire or was capable of being emperor was dead. So he kind of just got, it's like, you know, here you go. Nobody else wants this house, so you can have this house. So it's kind of like that. And Tiberius, for most of his life, after Augustus dies in 14 AD, spends most of his life, I believe, in the island of either Corsica or Sardinia or somewhere around one of the Mediterranean islands. And he didn't really want this. So for most of his reign, the senatorial elites kind of had more power and more say, and he kind of ruled from his villa, and he would rule for a good amount of years specifically. And throughout his reign, the empire is relatively peaceful. Likewise, he rules from 14 AD all the way to 37 AD, and in that time frame, Tiberius kind of just goes with what the people say. Like the senatorial elites would bring in news of new campaign ideas, trouble around the frontiers, or raids and stuff. And Tiberius will authorize the deployment of a legion in that area to get rid of that problem. Trade, innovation, and learning still prospered. Now, the start of Augustus's reign was a period known as Pax Romana, which meant Roman peace, and that peace would last for a long time, roughly 200 years after his death, and it is because of Augustus's wise reign of 40 years that every emperor and every potential emperor or successor would model and learn from his reign. He became the model to learn from, the model to see what to do and what not to do, how and how not to be a successful emperor. After Tiberius dies in 37 AD, possibly due to assassination by other members of the Julio-Claudian family, he is succeeded by a man named Caligula, who was the great-nephew and adopted grandson of Tiberius. He was the son of Germanicus, the man that could have been emperor, and he is the great-grandson of Augustus. And a lot of people don't like him because they think he was mentally unstable. He rules from 37 to 41 AD, a time span about 6 years, and the Praetorian Guards just had it with him. He was out of control. He named, I believe, a horse consul. He did a lot of crazy things, and because of that, he dies. He is succeeded by a man named Claudius. Claudius was the uncle of Caligula, and Claudius's most major accomplishment during his reign from 41 to 54 AD was the conquest of Britannia, something that Julius Caesar attempted, as I mentioned earlier, but couldn't finish. Claudius took his legions, went up there, got the job done, and incorporated Britannia into the Roman Empire as a province. And this would go on, conquest, for the rest of the Roman Empire up till 117 AD. Now, Claudius dies and is succeeded by the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a man named Nero. Nero is historically known for being lax, irresponsible, and extravagant. He didn't care, even to a lesser degree than Caligula and Claudius, about the affairs of the state. He was a poor administrator. He was no military leader, and the Senate and the patricians and the people hated him. He's best known for the fire of Rome, and historically he was known for starting the fire, but there is no actual evidence of that. So take that with a grain of salt. Uh, he rules from 54 to 68 AD before being assassinated. He actually commits suicide because he was declared a public enemy by the people in the Senate, and his death ends the Julio-Claudian line. Now, to kind of recap, we have an emperor that founds the Roman Empire in 27 BC, and this is the same man that rules successfully and respectively and loyal and gains the loyal respect and trust of the people, the wealthy, everybody, the soldiers. And after he dies, after 40 years, his empire goes on for his lineage goes on for another 50 years or so. So he dies in 14 AD, and his lineage survives till 68 AD. So, yeah. So we have to understand that Augustus created this lineage system where, unless you were a member of the Julio-Claudian line, you couldn't be emperor. And now we face this dilemma for the first time in the empire. There was no heirs or descendants left from Augustus and Julius Caesar. So the Julio-Claudian dynasty has officially come to an end. And what this means is that you had the Republic just doesn't know, the Empire, I'm sorry, at this point just doesn't know what the heck to do. So we enter a period from 68 to 96 AD known as the Year of the Four Emperors, which leads into another dynasty. So the Year of the Four Emperors, you have emperors like Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, who are four emperors who rule relatively for anywhere from a few months to a few days. The first was Galba, and it's in that order: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. And until they all fight, they're kind of either put on the throne by the Senate or put on the throne by the Praetorian Guards. They promise the Praetorian Guards they will pay them X amount of money, X amount of denarii, and they're put on the throne. Later, when they can't pay that money, they're killed off, and someone else is put on the throne who could pay them money, and that cycle kind of repeats until one man named Titus Flavius Vespasian comes on the throne and seizes power with the support of the Eastern legions. So this guy is stationed in like Anatolia or Egypt, and the Eastern frontier, and he comes to the throne, and he rules from 69 to 79 AD, and he dies from natural causes. Now, when he comes to the throne, he's already a very veteran, very aged man, and he forms what we know as the Flavian dynasty. The Flavian dynasty consists of three emperors: the emperors Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. And these three emperors would somewhat stabilize the empire from this abrupt unrest that it had seen with the Year of the Four Emperors. And Vespasian's successor Titus would rule from 79 to 81 AD before dying from natural causes of fever. There are historical sources that mention that his brother Domitian may have had a hand in his early death, but we'll never know. Later on, we have the Emperor Domitian, who starts off being a very young and very handsomely liked emperor, but later kind of shows some signs of Caligula in him. Like, he wasn't as bad as Caligula, but he showed some signs, and he was assassinated by his own steward, and I believe a plot garnered by his relatives. So he dies, but overall he rules for 15 years but dies. So then we have the second dilemma that happened with the end of the Julia-Claudian line. Who is emperor? Because none of his descendants survive, or he didn't even have any offspring. So we have now a dilemma. And at this point, the Senate comes in and is like, hold on, hold on. Why don't we appoint an emperor? Somebody who we know would like, and the people would like, and the Legion may not like, but we can make them like him. So we start the era that everybody, including Edward Gibbons, calls the best era of Roman history. And that is the era of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty. According to Edward Gibbons, the best time to live is during the ascension of Nerva, from the ascension of Nerva to the death of Commodus. So that is a long time, someone's lifetime, if I would say myself. 96 AD to 192 AD is a good amount of time. Nearly 100 years, about 99 years. And back then, if you could live to the age of 99, kudos to you. So Nerva was a very old senator who became emperor, and he knew that to succeed and have a lasting dynasty, he needed to have someone to back him up. Somebody who not only had the support of the people and the Senate, but also the support, the most important support, the support of the legions, the 28 legions of the Roman Empire. And this man turned out to be a man named Trajan. And Trajan, the first Spaniard emperor, happily took up the offer and became adopted. And Nerva started this series of adoptive emperors where you became emperor not because you were related by blood, but because you were either groomed or you had the merit and the ability to succeed as emperor. And we would see that with Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, that each of these emperors were chosen to succeed successfully. And under these emperors, specifically, the Roman Empire prospered to even greater heights. You start to have more Romanized barbarians also during this time. You start to have more incorporation of auxiliary greater than they had during Augustus's time. You start to have changes, but overall all these changes are good. Now, during Nerva's ascension, aside from civil unrest, riots and rebellions here and there throughout the empire remained relatively peaceful. During the reign of his successor, Trajan, the empire was successful, but Trajan wanted to kind of, make his reign a little bit more interesting. So during one of the uprisings around the Rhine, around this area right here, the Danube, he fought the people here, he conquered them, and later he decided to conquer to the east. And throughout his reign from 98 to 117 AD, he did just that. He waged war against the Parthians, and he took most of what you see here. He ventured into Mesopotamia, took Babylon, Ctesiphon, all these areas of the Parthian Empire he took. And upon his death, the Roman attitude towards conquest kind of gradually changed. Trajan spent all his life conquering that he kind of didn't have time to kind of be a good administrator, but when he did have time to be an administrator, he was a good administrator. So he was loved by the legion because he led them. He was liked by the Senate because he worked, and he was liked by the people because he gave them hope that the Roman Empire was, the Roman Empire was the best place to live, the best place to be, and you wanted to be in the legions. He kind of gave off that second Augustus vibe. And after Trajan dies, we start to see these barbarian tribes kind of confederate, and to an extent where they were much more of a threat than they were, say during the reign of earlier emperors. And this will become the problem of emperors like Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. And when Hadrian, the emperor, assumes the throne in 117 AD, he retreats and abandons much of these garrisons and fortresses that Trajan had set up, specifically along the eastern frontier as well as Britannia. And he forms the Hadrian Wall, which you can see right here. And he instead focuses on restructuring and reorganizing the administrative and cultural aspects of the empire. He reissues the coin. He restructures the trade around the Mediterranean and the trade with allies. He also restructures some of the legion. He redeploys them to different areas. Specifically, he redeploys a lot of them actually to the eastern frontier. He deploys a lot of them to Hadrian's Wall. He deploys a lot of them to northern Gaul and areas specifically right around here, and across the empire's borders to the north. And of course, we will also lose Dacia, that Trajan conquers during the Dacian Wars. We will lose that, and pretty much the empire will be like something like that for the rest of the history until roughly the 5th century, when we start to lose a lot more provinces. But aside from that, Hadrian rules a very successful reign, a very defensive reign, and when he dies in 138 AD to not natural causes, he is succeeded by a very, very wise and brilliant administrator named Antoninus Pius, who rules from 138 to 161, a good 22 years. And Antoninus Pius is known as the pious and peaceful because it was during his reign of the 5 emperors that Rome was most prosperous. You had no unrest in the empire. You had no major conflicts. You had little to no riots and rebellions, and pretty much everything prospered again, just like how it did under Augustus during Antoninus Pius's reign. So, on a side note, Antoninus Pius, the reason he earned the title Pius is because he's very forgiving and merciful. And in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, he goes a long way to kind of devote his whole book 1 to how great of a father Antoninus Pius is. So if you want to learn a little bit more about how pious he is, go read that. It's a great read. So Antoninus Pius rules a very good empire for 22 years, and in that 22 years, because there was no wars and no conflicts, he was able to triple the imperial reserve, the treasury. So much so that when his son Marcus Aurelius becomes emperor and fights in the Macromonic Wars around, I believe, around here, somewhere around here, he had not only the resources and the revenue to do so, but he also was able to do so because of the wise administrative money keeping that his father had done. So Marcus Aurelius assumes the throne upon the death of Antoninus Pius and co-rules with a man named Lucius Verus. And they both co-rule until Lucius Verus dies from possibly plague in 169, and from 169 to 180, Marcus Aurelius rules alone. He fights in the Macromonic Wars alone, and he is largely successful. But one thing to take away from Marcus Aurelius' reign is 2 problems. One, the barbarian problem that we mentioned with the reign of Hadrian and Antoninus Pius gets largely even worse during Marcus Aurelius' reign. Barbarian tribes that once were tribes have now unified into confederations greater than they were a few decades prior, and have started attacking the frontiers, causing a lot of casualties both to the tribes and the confederation as well as the Roman legions. And Marcus Aurelius spends all his reign pretty much fighting. He is never in Rome. He is rarely in Rome, sorry, and when he is in Rome, it's not for fun and games. So the reign of Marcus Aurelius is another one of conflict, mostly conflict and conflict and war. However, the empire itself does flourish and expand under Marcus Aurelius, and the last mistake Marcus Aurelius makes before his own death in 188 AD is he appoints his own son as emperor, his son Commodus as emperor, and this has never been done since the Nerva Antonine dynasty was established, and historians argue that it's the mistake. And personally, Commodus was groomed somewhat to be emperor from a young age, but Marcus Aurelius kind of died before he taught his son enough and gave some enough experience and enough teaching to be a good emperor. And Marcus Aurelius would die in 180 AD, and Commodus will become emperor from 177 to 192. So he co-ruled with his father for about 3 years. Unfortunately, 3 years was not enough, and he starts off a pretty good emperor. He gives back to the people. He hosts a lot of games, specifically in the Colosseum. He is loved by the people. He is feared by the Senate, and he is respected by the Legion only because he's the son of Marcus Aurelius and an heir to the Nerva Antonine dynasty. Most of the Legion like him because he fought alongside him during the Macromonic Wars with his father. However, most of that liking and devotion is kind of a homage to the late Marcus Aurelius, and not so much to Commodus. Now, Commodus is a very nice and loving emperor until he gets betrayed and an attempted assassin happens to him by his own sister. At that point, this young man kind of goes crazy. He starts to trust nobody, starts to murder people left and right. He doesn't know who to trust. He doesn't know who's enemy, who's foe, who's enemy, who's friend, etc., etc. And he kind of spends the rest of his reign around the 180s as a gladiator, trying to be Hercules, and eventually he gets strangled by a wrestler who he trusted very much. And in the 12 years of his reign, nothing really gets done. Barbarians still punch at the borders of the empire. They take some garrisons, they take some fortresses, but the legions are able to push back. But this is the point that Edward Gibbons and many historians pinpoint as the start of the decline of the Roman Empire. After Commodus dies, the Nerva Antonine dynasty dies with him. And again, we have this problem of no heirs, no direct descendants to inherit the throne. So once again, the empire is ravaged into, I would say, 4 decades. I'm sorry, not 4 decades. I would say about a decade of civil war and unrest, where we have 5 emperors: Pertinax, Didius Julianus, Septimius Severus, who would come out for the throne. Pertinax was the prefect of some military commander. I believe he was the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Don't count me on that. I'm not 100% sure. But he was proclaimed by the Praetorian Guard, and then he was kind of murdered by the Praetorian Guard. And then This man named Tiberius Julianus was appointed by the Senate. I'm sorry, he was let me think for a sec. He had a lot of money, so he bought the position from the Praetorian Guard, and then later he was murdered by the Senate because he did something to anger them. And then this man named Septimius Severus, who was likely a Berber of African descent, commanded many legions in North Africa and had the respect of many legions across the empire, garnished their support, and proclaimed himself emperor. And he was able to do so because he controlled not only the troops of the Pannonian legions, but like I said, he was respected by all, and he rules and he dies of natural causes, and he forms the first imperial dynasty of North Africa, the Severan dynasty, and his dynasty would last from 193 all the way up till 235. So almost half a century. The last descendant of his dynasty is a man named Alexander Severus, who is murdered by the army. And we're not going to go into details of all the emperors that lived during this time, because there are many. One thing to note is that it was during the reign of his son Caracalla that citizenship for the first time was given to anyone in the empire. Before, if you didn't live in Italy and you were an Italian citizen, you did not have Roman citizenship. You were just Roman, but not Romanized as a citizen. So, the Severan dynasty ends, and we have, in 235 AD, this period known as the crisis of the 3rd century, where civil war is abrupt. Everybody is proclaiming everyone is emperor. Each legion has their own emperor. Each region, each province proclaims their own emperor. And you have these legions that are going to war with one another. And a little insight into what a legionnaire looked like during the reign of Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, etc., etc., is like this. This is a standard Roman legion. You had the helmet, the spear, the shield, heavy armor, light armor. This man is just wearing heavy armor. You also had men like this. This is more of a 2nd to 3rd century Roman legionnaire. The heavy armor, the Lorica Segmentata, as it was called, was kind of abandoned because of the lack of resources as the crisis of the 3rd century started emerging, and lighter chainmail sort of armor was more favored. So the crisis of the 3rd century happens, and the empire kind of just disintegrates into 3 parts. Numerous emperors emerge during this time. You have numerous emperors emerge, all of them claiming to be the best. All of them claiming to be legitimate, and a man named Aurelian eventually comes around who successfully reunifies the empire. So this is the empire during the crisis of the 3rd century. It shatters into literally 3 parts. You have the core of the empire, which controls Spain, North Africa, Italy, Greece, and parts of Anatolia. Then you have the Gallic Empire, which controls Gaul and Britain. And then you have the Palmyrian Empire, which controls Egypt, the Levant, and Syria, and parts of Anatolia. And Aurelian comes along and he fights all these wars, and is successful in reconquering the Palmyrian Empire before it kind of breaks off into its own sovereign state. And the Gallic Empire also comes back after conquest from Aurelian, but unfortunately this man named Aurelian, who rules for only 5 years, is assassinated by his own Praetorian guards for unknown reasons. They probably just saw him as a threat, or they didn't like what he did. So he was assassinated. He is succeeded by a name named Tacitus, who was elected by the Senate to replace Aurelian. And Tacitus is dies of natural causes and or was assassinated. He only rules for about a year, actually less than a year, about 9 or 10 months. And emperors after him kind of just, rule for a little bit, a few months, then dies. One man named Probus rules for about 6 years, then dies, and then every other emperor after him rules for like about a year, and then dies. And with the death of the last emperor Carinus in 285 AD, we end the period known as the Principate that Augustus started, and we enter a new period known as the Dominate. And in the Dominate, we have the first emperor Diocletian, who is very well known and respected because he forms the Tetrarchy. The Tetrarchy is a new system right here, the first Tetrarchy in 293 AD. It splits the empire once again into 4 parts. Each of these 4 parts are ruled by either an Augustus or a Caesar. You had 2 Augustuses and 2 Caesars. The Augustuses were senior emperors, and the 2 Caesars were junior emperors. The 2 Augustuses held greater authority and respect above the Caesars, while the Caesars were the potential successors to the Augusti. So how this system worked as envisioned by Diocletian was that the Augusti would rule for a decade or 2, and then they would step down, retire, and then their power will be transferred to the Caesars, and in that point the Caesars would rule. And it is unclear exactly if the Caesars get to choose or the Augusti get to choose, but I believe, according to most historical sources I read, the Caesars get to choose their new Caesars while they're promoted to Augusti. And so Diocletian and Maximian, another friend of his, become emperors of the purple, and Diocletian moves the capital of his new empire in the east to Nicomedia. Maximian rules from Milan. Galerius, I believe, rules from somewhere. I believe it's somewhere in the central Greece. I can't recall the name. I know that Constantius rules from Trier in Gaul, the capital. And this system works for roughly, I would say, a few decades, 3-4 decades, until a man named Constantine comes into the reign. And Constantine was proclaimed emperor by the legions of Gaul. At this point, Diocletian had retired, and Galerius, as Augusti, refused to acknowledge him as Augusti. Instead, he gave him the position of Caesar, and that he would be able to succeed when Galerius dies. Constantine was not happy about that, and we have another era of civil unrest. And in this era of civil unrest, we have war across the empire. Constantine against Galerius, and it just gets crazy. Maximian's son Maxentius comes out and wants to be emperor too. He gets in the feud. A man named Licinius, the son-in-law of Constantius, the father of Constantine, also comes into the flux, and they all fight over the war. In the end, Diocletian dies after hearing that his great tetrarchy isn't working out. Maximian, Maxentius are killed. Galerius dies, I believe, from natural causes. Constantine rules the empire as sole Augustus for a good amount of time, 306 to 337. He proclaims Christianity as the state religion, but he still allows paganism to coexist, and a lot of people are pissed. A lot of people don't like that. So we have this disunified content going on, and upon his death, the empire falls into the hand of his sons and relatives. Constantine II rules. Constantius II rules. Constans II rules. The three sons of Constantine. You also had Constantine's nephews rule, part of the empire, I believe. Constantine rules this part, the second. Constantius this part. His relative, his niece and nephews, or his nephews, ruled this part, and I believe Constans, or I believe Constans rules this part. It could be the other way around. I'm not quite sure. So they rule for a good amount of time until they turn on each other, and at the end, you have one emperor left, and that emperor, his name is Constantius II. Constantius II is the most successful of all his brothers. He rules from 337 to 361, 24 years, and in that time, he rules literally the empire on his own. And he is succeeded by a man named Julian, who is the cousin of Constantius II, whose, I believe, fathers were the nephews of Constantine, and they were murdered. And he rules the empire after Constantius' death as sole emperor, and he is known for his wars in Persia, and he dies in 363 after ruling 3 years, and he dies from being mortally wounded in combat against Parthian cavalry. And Julian the Apostate is best known for being an apostate. He's a pagan, most notably the last pagan emperor, who tries to reform the empire into a pagan society but fails, and only God knows what would happen had he not died and he went through with his plan. But he dies, and he's succeeded by a man named Jovian, who rules for only 7 months before he himself is replaced by the Valentinian dynasty, led by Valentinian I, who would rule for about 11 years, and he would die from natural causes. The Valentinian dynasty would have emperors such as Valentinian I, who would rule the west. His brother Valens, who would rule the east, and Emperors Gratian and Valentinian II. And this is a very moderately okay dynasty. It rules from 364 to 392. And upon this dynasty's end, you have another dynasty known as the Diocletian dynasty, who would rule from 379 to 457. And then you had, of course, the last Western emperors, who all ruled for about anywhere from 4 years to a few months, and no one ruling more than 6 years. Their names aren't worth mentioning because they don't really accomplish anything. The names of emperors worth mentioning are most likely Valens, Diocletius I, and Diocletius II. Everybody after him aren't worth mentioning because they don't really contribute much to the empire. Valens was a great administrator, great military leader, and he dies at the Battle of Adrianople because he gets outsmarted and underestimates the Goths, a barbarian tribe that have become Romanized and come from around here. And what happens is that he was outnumbered. His reinforcements from the west never came. Valentinian's reinforcements just couldn't come in time, and he was slaughtered. But in the short amount of in the 14 years that he did rule the East, he was a good administrator. Um, he was liked by the people, and overall um, was he was respected by the legions. And Valentinian's successor was Gratian, who was the son of and he rules for about 16 years. He accomplishes somewhat of a good reign with a lot of inconsistencies, and he was murdered by the army. And Valentinian II became the emperor of the East, and were ruled from Milan. And he rules for a good 16 years before he also is murdered under mysterious circumstances. We're going to have a lot of these murders coming around after the crisis of the 3rd century with emperors. It just happens, you know. People are just unhappy. Now let's shift to the military aspect of the Roman legion. So the earlier Roman legions we mentioned were, you know, heavy, well-equipped, superior legions, veterans. After the crisis of the 3rd century, you don't really have veterans. You don't have a professional army. Armies at this point were conscripted. These were just people that were farmers that were just conscripted to serve in the army. You can see from this image that the shields that were kind of squarey has been replaced by, you know, larger circular shields with crosses on them to depict Christianity, lighter armor, sometimes no armor at all, some bronze or some bronze helmet to kind of help them defend themselves. And the army in the later empire from 3rd to 5th century were lighter equipped, lesser trained, lesser equipped, lesser trained. Some weren't even paid, and a lot of them were barbarians. So you see in the image here, this is a legion, or a part of a legion of comitatenses, which were the provincial armies that emerged following Constantine's victories. And you can see from this image that they had abandoned the gladius, the short sword used by iconic legions, and have adopted more of a long sword, which is very barbaric, I would say. And they have started to inscribe further designs in their shields. On a note of barbarianism, you can see in this picture that barbarians have truly become Romanized and incorporated into the legions. Back in the day, they would serve as the auxiliary forces because they were barbarians, but by the 4th and 5th and 3rd, mid-3rd, 4th and 5th century, they simply served in the Roman army, either as the federati or as a legionnaire. And they would bring their own armor, their own skills, their own hairstyles, and they would fight for Rome because they either were mercenaries or they were citizens of the Roman frontiers, and they were needed, and they obeyed. By 476 AD, months before its fall, this is the extent of the Roman Empire. The Eastern Empire survives till 1453, and you can see in the year 476 that it has no problems whatsoever surviving. In the West, however, you can see that the Roman Empire in this map has shrunk into just this little here and parts of Pannonia and Italia here. Yeah, not a lot has left. A lot of the provinces were lost to barbarians, and sadly, that's what happens when you transition a military from a professional military into a mercenary / conscripted military. This is what happens when you have centuries, if not decades, of countless civil wars, killing each other, disrupting trade, burning down farms, villages. When you have incompetent emperors, one after another, who assassinate able generals and who sees people who are doing progress and good for the empire as a threat to their own authority. And you also have just unprofound unprofound problems in the empire, starting all the way back from communists all the way up till the fall in 476. So the eight main reasons I would say that caused the decline and fall of the empire in the West was number one, barbarian tribes. Barbarians just started ravaging the empire, first as single tribes, then as conglomerate confederations, and eventually as invading forces. You started with, at first you had just unorthodox, you had Britannic tribes, for example. You had the tribes in Gaul, you had the tribes in Hispania, small tribes that were not Romanized, easy to deal with. Then you had, the Dacian Wars. You had the Dacian Wars, the Gaulish Wars. You had these wars that were harder to put down because they were unified, but they were still put down. And then later, during the 3rd and 4th century, you had these large-scale immigrations, not invasions, immigrations of barbarians into Roman lands. And these barbarians not only are Romanized, educated, smart, and outfitted and trained in the Roman ways, they were also numerous. These are the same people that the Romans had hired as mercenaries and as federati, and these people know the way the Roman Empire works, and slowly they began to take part in Roman politics and Roman society as federati, and this kind of contributed a great amount to Rome's eventual decline because it abandoned its military in favor of a weaker conscription-based, mercenary-based army, and this would backfire severely. So that's one major reason. Another reason is economic troubles and over reliance on slave labor. Well, the Roman Empire was formed on the basis of labor, hard labor, and during the reign of Augustus and Marcus Aurelius, you had people to conquer. You had tribes to conquer. You had the resources, the manpower, and the support to do so. So you conquer these people, you bring back the slaves, they work for you, profit. By the 3rd and 4th century, not only do you have a reduced military presence, your military is no longer veterans. All the veterans died in the crisis of the 3rd century, countless civil wars. All you have left are fresh recruits, barbarians who have no loyalty to you, but only to the money in your bag and your treasury. And also you have no easy targets to conquer and no slaves to easily import into the empire to do your bidding. So the economy kind of goes downhill from there. You also have various Gothic groups coming in, killing off your men left and right, stealing resources from your garrison and forts, and encroaching upon your villages, sacking, looting. And you can't do anything about it because, like I said, you don't have the resources or the men to do it. The Comitia Tensei and the Limitani system that was invented following Diocletian created three main aspects of the army. You have the Comitia Tensei, which kind of is the new legion. They're known as provincial armies. They respond to provincial threats such as rebellion and whatnot. You had the Limitani, which were pretty much just the militia, frontier guards that would fight and hold the frontier until the Comitia Tensei will arrive. And then you had the Palatina guards, which replaced the Praetorian guards under Constantine the Great, and their sole responsibility is to protect the emperor and to go and be where the emperor was, kind of like the Praetorian Guards, but they were lesser equipped, lesser trained, and lesser experienced than the Praetorian Guards or the Roman legions of old. The Eastern Roman Empire was able to survive mostly because it had a lot of money and it had a lot of resources. So it took those money and resources and bribed a lot of the barbarians, such as the Goths, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, you name it. Told them to move west. Go west. Go west. There's land in the west to settle. So they go west. And what does this do? Well, this creates a humongous burden on the west, while it relieves a lot of burden in the east. And while the east grows, the west just kind of crumbles. The divide in 395 AD by Theodosius kind of puts a tombstone on the Western Empire. It allows the East to kind of largely ignore the problems of the West at the same time prospering on its own, and it also allowed the West to kind of have to fend for themselves for the first time. Also, because all the resources and wealth were in the West, in the East. I'm sorry, not the West, the East. The West kind of had to find ways to raise revenue, so it kind of raised taxes. A lot of the soldiers in the army went unpaid, mercenaries went unpaid, and that this led to riots and famine. It was just bad. Like I mentioned before, the civil wars of the crisis of the third century, of the usurping, and of countless wars with Persia and other barbarian tribes led to military overexpansion and overspending, and it just led to the Roman Empire in the West not having the resources to fund an army. And corruption and political instability was widespread, both in the East and West, but more so in the West because of the reasons we mentioned already. It just couldn't afford to have corruption and things like that. The main factor of corruption and political instability lay in the hands of the Praetorian Guard. Hence is why Constantine abolished them once he became emperor. But this wasn't the only reason. It was just one of the reasons. Attila the Hun would arrive in the 5th century, the early 5th century, the 400s, and he would destroy and ravage anything that was in his way, which led primarily to a large immigration of barbarians at the borders of the Eastern and Western empires, in which case the Eastern emperors just bribed to go to the West. Some blame the rise of Christianity and Constantine's Constantine's reorganization of the empire's religion into Christianity as one of the main causes of the fall of the Roman Empire, being that abandoning the traditional Roman gods doomed the people of Rome into distress. This is especially the case with Edward Gibbon, who is widely criticized, but he proves a pretty pivotal point in his book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, that Christianity was the pivotal cause of the loss of the Western provinces and the Western Empire. So, I like to just kind of end this video because it's probably like an hour more or so long on why the empire fell. The empire fell for a lot of reasons. There is no one reason the empire fell. It's like you're trying to build, it's just like you're trying to build a house and you're trying not to make the house fall, but every small, screw you unscrew will cause the house to eventually fall. And all those reasons I mentioned already are just only some of the reasons that may have contributed to the empire's fall. But if there's anything to take away, definitely weak, incompetent successor emperors played a big role in the decline and fall of the Western Emperor, and also the loss of veteran legionnaires during the crisis of the 3rd century, as well as all the civil wars, caused a big decline in the eventual collapse of the empire. Alas, the mismanagement and constant invasions by barbarian tribes also contributed largely to the eventual decline of the empire. But one closing question for this video is, why was the West able to fall while the East stood high for another 1,000 years? And that question can be answered simply because the East had the resources, the East had the legions, and the East had good emperors. While the West had inadequate emperors and usurpers and people who thought they were emperors, the East had emperors. They had people like Leo the First. They had Zeno. They had people like Justinian later on, and Basil and Heraclius. All those, they had emperors that established effective dynasties, something that the Western Empire was not able to do after Constantine. Because, or actually after, for the Western Empire, I would argue after the Nerva Antonine dynasty, the subsequent dynasties had no successive emperors, where the founding emperors were excellent emperors, but then their sons were all incompetent. So the title of this video was The Rise and Decline of the Roman Empire. It's a hard title to fully understand, because not everybody understands why the empire fell. There's not one factor why. You can read Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He goes into tremendous detail about why the empire fell, but it doesn't fall because somebody did one thing. It fell because the empire was neglected. It fell because of various factors. Moving the empire from Rome to Ravenna, moving the empire from Rome to Milan to Ravenna was too little too late. The historical significance of Rome deteriorated following the crisis of the 3rd century, and hence was one of the reasons why Constantine moved the capital of Rome to Constantinople. So from this we can all infer that what happened happens, but history is something that we can't go back and repeat, but we can learn from. And even though Rome is gone in the West and is gone in the East today, the cultures of Rome and the legacy that Rome left us as a society in Western culture is evident all around us. For example, if you look at the calendar, if you look at the names of the months, if you look at our government structure, the government structures of people all across the world, of people and governments throughout time, you can see that Rome has left lasting impacts in all our history books and all our lives. Thank you for watching, guys, and stay cool.